Sometimes we get so caught up in trying to attain this thing that we will never kind of stop to think or question even if this is the person that we want those things with. I think it goes back to that whole fear of starting over, and when you're kind of thinking about, I've put so many years into this relationship and I don't want it to be a waste, or I've put all of this in because I thought he was the one.
Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of Life Uncut. I'm Laura.
I'm Brittany.
Now, we have spoken about it on the podcast so many times around different decades of age or years. I always say that my 20s were an absolute effing shit show. They were just like the years where everything seemed to go wrong and I don't know what I was doing.
Yeah, but then I always talk about the fact that I hit my 30s as well, and I did not have the life I thought I was going to have. I was so single. I'd been dumped on The Bachelor. I didn't have the white picket fence. I didn't have kids, didn't know where I was going. And it's like this idea that society says you've got to have your shit together when you really just don't.
Do you feel though, Britt, and I know this is an intro, but we'll get into that in a second. Do you feel like your 30s were better than your 20s? Or do you feel like when did you peak?
Oh man, my 20s were pretty litty. Like I had great 20s because I was, in my 20s, I traveled to 50 countries. I went like around the world with my sister, but I was broke. And it's different now because now I have more money because I've got more of a stable job, but I don't have the time and freedom to go and do and live the life I wanted. So I think it's a catch-22.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So I think that we can approach new decades, and especially real milestone birthdays like your 20s or your 30s or whatever it looks like for you, and be fearful about what it is to come. And I do think that there's something very unique about the decade of being in your 30s. It's the years where a lot of us figure out our relationships. It's where a lot of us figure out what we want in our careers, or we've come into a little bit more autonomy. But getting a better understanding of what that looks like can be really frightening. We have Bridget Hustwaite joining us today on the podcast, and that is because Bridget has written a book, and it is called Figuring Out 30, which is all about this topic, something that we have unpacked so many times in our own lives. And I guess in some ways we're still figuring it out ourselves. Bridget is familiar to the podcast. We've had her on before to speak about endometriosis so long ago when we very first started. But Bridge, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to catch up because, the last time that we did speak about endo, that was when shit was really kicking off for me, but I was just in book press mode for how to endo, but all this kind of personal internal chaos was happening, but I couldn't really tell you about it, but now I can a couple of years later.
Well, yeah, so for those that may have missed it, we will link it in our show notes, but we did do an entire episode with Bridget around endometriosis. And now we are going to crack on to all the unexpected lessons that you've learned and all about the book. But before we do, you have shared previously a banging Accidentally Unfiltered where you vomited at your work Christmas party. But do you have another one for us?
I do. Well, the one that I thought of was the most recent one that's happened. And in a nutshell, it was telling Troye Sivan to go wee wee, and it got captured on national live TV. And it was,
why did you say wee wee? Oh, you just go do a wee wee.
Yeah, I just said to him, you go wee wee. It was at the Arias just recently.
It's like how I talk to my dog.
I know. And I just decided to be like, go toily toy. Like Troye Sivan, the cameras weren't meant to be rolling, and they were. And then I watched the Arias back on, on Stan, and that whole thing is in conversation. He needed to go to the toilet. He just won an Aria, and so we had him backstage, and, we wanted to make it quick for him because he was clearly needing to pee. Yeah, and it was actually a bit of an extensive chat, and so we try wrap it up, and then I'm staring at the camera thinking that it goes off because, when you're on TV and you stare at it for a few seconds and everyone's just walking around as if we have just gone off air, and I just turned to him and go, you go wee wee, and he's like, yeah, I go wee wee, and walked off. Friggin' made it to the broadcast.
I'm more interested in whether you said it satirically. Was it meant to be a joke, or is it just something that you would say in a normal conversation? Yeah, I gotta go.
Normal conversation. Perfect. It was so nurturing of me, but I did not intend that to make the broadcast.
It's always my fear, working in radio or TV or whatever, when you have an aspect of being live, it's always my fear that somehow it's going to, when you're talking in between breaks or whatever, that you're going to go to air. You need to really monitor yourself.
See, the mum vibes in me is just there's nothing wrong with saying wee wee. I'd be like, do you want me to wipe your bum? Do you need me to wipe your bum?
She says that to me all the time.
Exactly. But it was just such a professional, considered music chat going straight to that. And yeah, I don't know. Don't trust anyone. Don't trust any producers. Don't trust Cage. No, it will be fine. But like, you just never know when the cameras are still on, still rolling.
I mean, we got the press release for your book that kind of rolled across our desk, and Keisha literally devoured the book in a weekend and was like, you need to speak to Bridget about this. And, you know, I kind of think about like I said, I think about my 30s and I think about how they've been such pivotal years for me. Like so much change has happened, but I also think they've been some of the best years of my life so far. What was it about figuring out 30 or turning 30 that made you want to write a book about it?
Well, approaching 30, I thought I had everything kind of down pat. So on paper, it looked really good that I was hosting my own radio show. I was an author. Well, yeah, becoming an author. No, I was an author approaching
You're an
30
author,
because that was
yeah.
March. Yeah, already an author approaching 30. 5-year relationship. So felt like that was pretty concrete, I guess.
Which is laughable now.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But so these things on paper, you know, financially independent, all looked really good, but there was still just a very lingering sense of unease about approaching 30. It kind of built up over the months, but as I was getting nearer and nearer, and then there was just this one night, middle of the night, and it ended up being 4 days before I got dumped. 4 days before that even happened, I was up at like 1 a.m. and just put a notes entry in my phone being like, I don't know what it is, but like I'm freaking out about turning 30. Like, why? I have all of these things. I mean, I'm not married and I don't have kids and I haven't owned like my own pet yet. I'm not sure if those are the things that are freaking me out, or I'm just getting this weird sense of unease. And I don't know if that was a weird anticipation of, I guess, what was to come. But it's a really interesting thing because I don't think I was thinking about it at all until just, those very close moments leading up to actually turning 30. And, you know, being in lockdown was probably an interesting situation with it as well, because I was kind of confined to this apartment that I was living in with my partner at the time. And I was feeling restless in that sense. But then I kind of was looking around me, and I guess more so from my friends back home in Ballarat, being in like a regional area, there's people settling down, and some of my ex's friends were getting married and stuff. And I just didn't feel like a grown up, the kind of grown up that I thought I needed to be come 30. There was definitely a gap between where I was at and where I thought I should be. And so that kind of catapulted everything. I mean, the breakup was 6 days before How to Endo came out, and it was just freaking chaos. The year of 30 was just such a huge transformative year for relationships, fertility, even just looking back at family stuff and being like, why am I the way that I am? It was a really big personal debrief. And also just thinking about, why are women in particular freaking out about this? And why do we have the pressures with aging and, you know, the biological clock and this crazy sense of urgency? And can we please talk about it more?
Yeah, I definitely think that 30 as an age, it's kind of like the first time that you become really conscious of age. I mean, my 20s kind of just like sailed by. I never had a point in my 20s where I was like, oh, I need to think about these things. But it was the year I also turned 30 that I was like, fuck, my life is not where I thought it was going to be.
It's because we as a society put that expectation on. And the fact that we just make 30 the benchmark, because it is a new decade where you are supposed to have a little bit more responsibility, because everyone gives you a bit of leniency in your 20s to be like a bit
hot
of
mess.
a bit of a wanker, not great with your money, whatever it is, you get a hall pass. But in your 30s, you don't get as much grace, I don't think. And also I think it comes from, I'd love to know what you think as well, but 30 is crucial for women because we are told statistically and scientifically, biologically, that our biological clock is slowing down. So that's just not a number that we've pulled, from anywhere. Society pulls numbers out of their butthole when it's like you should own a house by 30, but it's a little bit different when it comes to fertility because we know there is a clock. Do you reckon you have any more insight now, since you've done this deep dive on yourself, on, for you specifically, do you think that all of this unease and anxiety that you felt that night, do you think that came more from your own internal pressures or from society's pressures? Or do you think maybe you felt a little bit unsettled because you knew maybe something was about to change a few days later? As you said, you got broken up with.
Yeah, kind of all the above, I think. I think there was definitely When I look back at my 20s, I was 21 when I started to be really career focused and really striving to be a music presenter. And I got my first full-time gig in that field at the age of 27. So the thought of kids was just never in question, nor was marriage. I never felt any direct pressure from my parents or anything. They've been amazing in that regard. Like, I've never once felt an ounce of pressure from them that I need to marry someone or settle down or have kids for that matter. So I think there was, I guess, that internal comparison. I think, again, with lockdowns, because I was in Melbourne, so I was very confined. And once you kind of come out of the lockdowns too, or even when you're in the midst of it, there was a really interesting thing that I read called the pandemic skip. So it's kind of like, you don't feel like, a lot of my friends turned 30 in lockdown, and you don't feel like you're that age because you haven't been able to go out and experience, those last few years or months leading into your 30s. But now you're kind of at that age where you initially thought, this is when I was going to have kids. I mean, my mum had 4 kids under the age of 4 when she was 32, and I'm 33, and I just could not relate to that at all. Like, that terrifies me. When I think about home ownership as well, I mean, obviously cost of living is cooked. So that was never a direct pressure, but I think it's like a historical societal pressure, because what we've seen previous generations do, and I think being like millennial women, we've kind of been I don't want to say we're the first, but we're a generation where we haven't been literally ticking off tick, 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 because our parents, were going through that time where women were beginning to be in the workplace, but now we are very much in it.
I think it's fascinating to me, though, because this is such a universal feeling that so many women in their 30s have. But the thing is, so many of us feel like this collectively, but so many of us are not in, stable relationships, or the relationship that we thought we would be in by this time. A lot of us don't have the jobs or the careers that we thought we would have. And I'm not sure if there is, even though a lot more people are talking about it, I don't know if we find collective comfort in this, because I still think we compare ourselves. Every day on Ask Uncut, we get questions from people who are all different ages who say, like, my life is just not where I expected it to be. For you, going through a breakup, a really significant one just before 30, how did you grapple with that change of identity from going from, okay, this is what I thought life was going to be, and now I'm here and I have to rebuild?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because again, you realize that space of where I was, where I thought I would be, and I hadn't fully yet embraced, I guess, the idea that those traditional markers of success didn't necessarily apply to me in the way that I expected. I just didn't know how to sit with that. And I think with a breakup as well, I mean, that was the first snowball, and it was a very significant one at that, because, it was funny, despite having such a personality out there, being on Triple J and stuff, I felt like my identity had really collapsed when that breakup happened. And then going straight into book press mode too, not that I didn't have a chance to process it, I kind of had a real I had no choice but to kind of, face it front on and sign up for therapy. And, I really made a conscious effort to make sure I was processing things in real time, but I also didn't want it to taint the success of my book and everything.
Did you see it coming?
The breakup?
Yeah.
Look, it should have happened 4 months before it happened.
Yeah.
So we had a conversation 4 months beforehand where I actually came to him and said that I was feeling unhappy. I was actually looking at getting my own rental, and I think that was I don't want to say a red flag, because
it's a pretty big red flag for a relationship.
It's a pretty big,
5 years deep,
I think it's a red flag
for when red flag, but it really is.
Especially when you're already living together.
100%.
So don't want to say that, there are some relationships out there where they don't live together for a really long time. But for us to go from living together to me now thinking about just having my own space again, and I was really yearning a sense of independence. And again, lockdown probably amplified that. But I also was thinking, but I was suppressing it so much because I was approaching 30, that I was like, no, this is the one. This is the relationship. This is the serious relationship after my last youthful, reckless relationship. And we're approaching 5 years. I think what we really struggle with at this point in our lives, as we enter our 30s and throughout our 30s, even our 40s for women, is the fear of starting over.
100%.
We hear so much about FOMO and being left behind, and there's a very unique tension between those. But it's something about the fear of starting over that really terrifies women, and for good reason. I mean, if you look at pop culture, what we grew up watching, I mean, and how 30 was embodied. Bridget Jones, Rachel Green, calculating the timeline in Friends.
That's Friends, Laura. Laura doesn't watch Friends, so I'll just break that down
Oh, okay. We'll have to send you. That's a good episode to start on.
Yeah.
To be fair, I only started watching it in the last 18 months.
Oh, blasphemy, both of you.
I think as well, this idea of starting again, it is such a recurrent question that we get through our Ask Uncuts from our listeners. The fear of starting again also comes from this fear of, well, what if I don't get something that's better than this? Like, what if this is as good as I either A, deserve, or B, I can get, especially when you find people who have found themselves in relationships that maybe aren't fulfilling, but they're a nice person. They're not in a toxic relationship. They're just dating essentially someone that they've maybe outgrown.
I think also tied into it as another layer is the sunk cost fallacy of, well, I'm 30 and I've already contributed 5, 6, 7 years of my life to this person. Like, I don't want to quote unquote waste that time. Like, what a waste that would be to start again now. So I think it's like aspects of all three.
What did starting again look like for you?
Well, I mean, in that moment, so we were 3 weeks into a new rental lease. We'd signed on for this. We just moved into a new townhouse. So we were on like a month-to-month kind of thing, but we signed on this new 12-month lease, kept checking in with him throughout that whole process, being like, are you sure you want to do this? Things were kind of tense, I guess, stress with that move, also in the lead up to the book. Things were definitely tense between us. And it's funny looking back, because we were literally sleeping back to back in bed. There was no affection, so much distance. And I guess, was also so caught up in my book stuff that I didn't kind of clock it at the time. So, Dolly Alderton has used a really great kind of analogy of sorts about this. She said in her life lessons, like, if you had a big red button in front of you and if you could press it and, you get through a breakup and all the practical things were no fuss, like it was fine. Don't even think about those things. They would be taken care of. If you could press a button that allows you to do it, would you break up with this person? And if you're saying yes, then it's like, well, you got to break up with them because it's the practical aspect. And yes, that whole starting over. For me, it was, having to find a new apartment to live in because there was like no way I was going to stay in this friggin' townhouse that we just broke up in. Those logistical things. It's also the unraveling of routines, of relationships that you have with their family and friends, the dividing of belongings. I mean, fortunately, in our case, at least, it could have been way more stressful in the sense that we didn't have a pet, we didn't have kids, we didn't have a mortgage, we didn't have joint bank accounts. So in comparison to other situations, it wasn't all bad, but it was still fucking stressful. But we got there. It just took time, but it was not fun.
Bridget, you wrote in your book, the older you get, the higher the stakes are. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that in terms of relationships specifically?
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to that whole fear of starting over. And when you are in your 30s and even if you are in your 40s as well, the older you get. And, when I think back to my first breakup, right? So I just had to pack my toothbrush and get going. That was it. There really wasn't much to it. A couple of drunken follow-up hookups in the months, that came, and that was stupid. But there was no big, it wasn't a big breakup. This was a big breakup because there was 5 years of emotional investment. I think the emotional investment side of things is very underestimated at this period in our lives because, as you guys said before, when you're kind of thinking about, I've put so many years into this relationship and I don't want it to be a waste, or I've put all of this in because I thought he was the one. And I definitely put my ex on that pedestal of being the one, and he wasn't. But I think I was also just so scared of failure, and that the relationship wouldn't work out, and it should be working out at that age. So I think that's a big part of it. The higher the stakes, again, it kind of goes back to, if you in the relationship and you're not sure, but you're still cruising along and you are, you get to that point where you might have kids and you have more of these practical things, and it just makes the whole separation a lot more difficult for you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I love this, but I almost think it has a time limit to it because it's like the older you get, the higher the stakes are. I would say that for a woman, the highest stakes are kind of in your 30s or in your 40s. Yeah. And for a lot of people who want children, once you've gone past that window of fertility, that window of, yes, do I want kids? Is this the person? And we're kind of like, you know, a lot of relationship decisions in these years for a lot of people, and I don't want to speak for everyone because there's loads of people who don't want to have kids, but they're driven by this idea of like, okay, I can't waste time. The thing is that once you get to a certain age, you might be in your 50s or your 60s. And I have friends who are dating now in that age group, and they're like, I have no time for bullshit because there's nothing that keeps me wanting more with this person if they're not amazing. Because what am I going to do? Spend 20 years with some fucking loser until I'm 70? But they're not going to like almost progress it as quickly as they might have had they been in a window when kids was part of this equation.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, and it's to no fault of their own, because again, it speaks to this wider societal pressure and the biological aspect. Sometimes we get so caught up in trying to attain this thing, and again, it's the idea of it as well, that we will never kind of stop to think or question even if this is the person that we want those things with. It's almost like you'll do, like, let's just get it done. I mean, and I'm not saying that's the case for a lot of people, but I know I've definitely been guilty of having that kind of mindset, especially when I was 29, because I was starting to think about children. Then I was actually thinking, I was doing my own timeline. So I was like, oh, you know, maybe 31, I'll take maternity leave from the ABC and I'll stop doing good nights for that year. And that's when we'll have a kid. But I wasn't actually in a state or ready to have kids, but I was just doing the math there because I felt that deadline.
And I know I'm the one who made it just about children in that kind of questioning. But I do also think it pertains to other aspects. Like it could be about getting married and having, you know, because when all your friends and everyone around you seem to be in happy relationships, they're getting married or they're moving in with their partners, all of these things kind of shine a spotlight on yourself and you go, oh, well, why don't I have that? Or who is that person that I'm going to do those things with?
Even career as well. Like even thinking about career, being scared to, you know, quit or change industries at that age.
100%.
It's all terrifying.
Yeah, and it does come back to that idea of what you said, Britt, like this idea of how much time you've put into something is how much harder it is to walk away from it entirely. You speak about an interesting relationship dynamic that you have, and it's something that a lot of people have to navigate, is kind of as we get older, figuring out what does that relationship look like with our parents or also with our siblings when we no longer have like a juvenile relationship with them because we've got to be friends with them, but we move into adults who can choose the relationships we have. You know, in my life, like Matt doesn't have a relationship with his dad. He made an active decision in his 30s that he doesn't speak to his dad anymore, and that's the relationship they have. But something a lot of people might not know about you is you have a twin.
Yeah, and it surprises people because it's like not only a sibling, but it's a twin.
Yeah,
you know,
like
and
you like the same person.
we womb mates, you know, and I think because it kind of stems back to that ideal or assumption that, you know, twins are the closest bond of all. And by no means am I disputing that, because I've seen that for pretty much all the twins that I do know, except for my situation. My dad's also a twin. He's got a twin sister, but also no contact. So estrangement is a real, honestly, the topic of family dynamics and estrangement, I think, was the biggest one for me. You know, once I got over the real bumpy bits of heartbreak, I really was wanting to I just had this crazy curiosity. It's like, you know, when you're a toddler and like you'll have this Laura, like when your girls are like, but why, but why, but why? And they're constantly asking, but why? For me, when I was 30, I was just like, why am I like this? Like, why do I, you know, regulate my emotions like this? Or why do I stress like this? And how has both my parents had quite abusive upbringings. My dad had a very abusive upbringing, and his dad took his own life. So I never met his dad. That was before I was born, but it was kind of as a result of this just awful upbringing that he was responsible for. So there's just been a kind of a legacy of trauma, I suppose, that has kind of trickled through my family web, and coming to understand how that has influenced me as a person, but also my familial relationships, and why estrangement is just so big in my family. Like estrangement is my normal. So I have a twin sister, and, you know, she decided to essentially cut me off, would have been 9 years ago, but then we briefly had contact the year that we were 30, and it was looking promising that we were able to, like, get on that path of mending the relationship. But then she kind of cut me off again. And it was a very, I'm sure she has her reasons, but it was a very devastating thing for me, like to have this breakup and then a few months later have this ghosting essentially from twin sister. And it's a very interesting thing to talk about, right? Because you want to be, and to write about, because I've wanted to be very conscious of how I'm articulating it and to talk about my feelings and my experience and kind of look at this bigger picture as to what it means for estrangement and family dynamic in a broader sense without exposing relatives or making them feel like,
well,
you don't want to air dirty laundry.
And it's half a story. You can tell your side of a story and your side as to why a relationship dynamic doesn't exist anymore. But that only accounts for that version of it and not the reasons why someone might have made the decisions they've made. It's something that's prevalent. And I think a lot of people, as we get older, have to decide whether or not they want to keep family members as part of their life. It could also be because, you might have a challenging relationship with a parent and then you decide, well, do I want this person to actually be a grandparent figure for my children? There's so many parts of relationship dynamics that have to be figured out as you're older. And I think sometimes when you're growing up, you kind of just get dealt the cards that you get dealt. But then when you're an adult, you get to choose the people that you surround yourself with, and family looks different for different people.
Yeah. And especially in the case of thinking about whether or not I want to start my own family, for me, I was like, I need to just figure out the family that I've already got before I even think about starting a new one. Yeah. I just had this crazy curiosity about it. And it's also kind of, a really big part of growing up with this is coming to that place where you're able to practice empathy for the other person, for the other relative, because like you said, there's always going to be two sides. And I have to respect that from my siblings and particularly my twin sister. It's having empathy for that, but also, I suppose, just not normalizing it, but I just would love to have more conversations that this is actually a really common thing. Not only is it a very common thing for people to experience, especially in adulthood, but it's not a decision that's ever made lightly for anyone involved. We don't just do it for shits and giggles. And I mean, you just have to look at the queer community as a prime example of, for so many of them not being accepted by their family, and they want nothing more than to be accepted by their family, but to protect their well-being, their boundaries, and for them to feel accepted, sometimes they have to just cut off those ties. It's never a decision that is easy, but for many people, it's just out of necessity. And that's just what it is.
So to be clear, you don't just have estrangement just from you and your sister. All the three other siblings that you have, they don't talk to your parents at all. You're the only one of four siblings that have regular contact with your parents.
Yeah. So my older sister, I think she is in contact with them every now and then, but I'm the only child who will go back, to stay at their house. I have Christmas with them every year. Yeah, it's the constant relationship. So, and honestly, I don't even know if my siblings talk to each other. I just don't know.
Do you understand why?
I understand. I mean, not fully my older brother and sister. I understand from a broad sense of, when we think about our upbringing, and, I mentioned this in the book, and it prompted a difficult conversation with my dad. So due to his abusive upbringing and how I guess that kind of trickled through to the way that he was a father, he really struggled with regulating his emotions. And we just remember him as really angry and scary. And I think it just got to the point, I remember, my twin sister never really got along with him and never wanted a relationship with him. And I think for my older sister moved out of home when she was 17 to go do journalism cadetship. And my brother, I had a conversation with them about 9 years ago about how I guess it had made him feel. And we've never, the last time we were all together was my 21st birthday party, and I'm 33. Wow. So I don't know, I haven't sat down with them to be all right, let's, hash this out. I reconnected with my cousin who's in New Zealand and is the daughter of my dad's twin sister, who I haven't seen for, nearly 20 years. I actually connected with her the year I turned 30 because, me and Dad had a bit of a blow up, and we had a Zoom for 2 hours, and she told me about her upbringing because of how her mum was, you know, in an abusive upbringing and how that trickled to her parenting. And it's a really big chapter in the book, and it's very hard to kind of tell it in a nutshell. But yeah, I don't know if that opportunity will come about or if there's even a desire to like sit down with the siblings. But again, it just has, even though I don't know their full perspective, you still, and I may never will, but you still kind of have to have that kind of empathy and acceptance and kind of just focus on like how it's affected me and how I want to be better out of it from my end, if that makes sense.
It's such an interesting conversation to talk about. And we've spoken to Sam Fisher on this podcast before. For anyone who wants to go back and listen to that, we had a really it was quite a intimate conversation around how he chose to no longer have a relationship with his dad. And I think unless you come from a family where estrangement is a thing, it's really hard to understand how you could ever get to a point where you choose not to have a relationship with either a parental figure or a brother or a sister. And I think sometimes people think, well, there must have been really bad abuse. Like there must have been the abuse must be so bad that it's unforgivable. And in some cases, that's absolutely the case. But in other cases, it's a subtle yet consistent disregard for your boundaries or your respect. And I think as an adult, you get to a point where you go, do you know what? I no longer want to be disappointed by my parents. I no longer want to be disappointed or devalued. And so there's a choice that's made because you're like, it's very considered, it's very hard, but you go, I will be happier if I stop putting my happiness in you actually showing up to this relationship in a way that's healthy for me. And unfortunately, it is a choice that some people have to make. And I know even for us, we had these really big conversations, Matt and I, around when we had kids or when we got married, because Matt's dad's never been a part of that, and the kids have not met him. And I was like, oh, do you think the kids, maybe he should meet the children? And Matt was kind of like, I'm not doing that for me and I'm not doing that for them, so I'd be doing it for you. And that's a weird thing. So yeah, it's a big conversation that absolutely permeates some families.
And I think what makes it even harder is is the reaction from external people, you know,
100%.
because
they can't understand it.
Yeah, because we always view family as the sole centerpiece of our life, and it's certainly true to an extent, but it doesn't have to be the sole fulfillment, much like just having, you know, the one in a romantic sense. But that's probably been the hardest thing for me, is the reactions. And because for me, it's my normal, I've accepted it, so I don't really know any different. For other people who hear you have a twin and wow, what's that like? What do you mean you don't talk to your twin? And it's just I mean, I don't know. And I think that's why people really don't like talking about it, or they feel a lot of shame, like it's their fault and that they've failed in some aspect, when it is more common than what we think. And yeah, I really hope that chapter in particular helps people, you know, open that dialogue or just feel a little bit more seen and validated. I mean, for me at least, writing it just again prompted some difficult conversation with my dad, because he and mum had to sign off on it. You know, they have to sign off on what you're saying, and that wasn't easy. But I was, but dad was really good, and he was like, you know, if this is important for you and your growth and, you know, for your book, and I'm happy for you and I support it, and, you know, this is great. But it wasn't easy, and I felt sick that they had to read it, and I had to be very careful being again, it's not an attack or exposing you or saying it's not a right or wrong. Again, it's just coming back to how I've felt and coming back to me understanding why I am the way I am and what I want to do with that kind of knowledge moving forward in my 30s.
Do you feel like the relationship you have had with your family and with your brothers and sisters, has that had any impact on whether or not you think you want to go down the track of having your own family?
Yeah, absolutely. This whole dynamic has been probably a big influence as to why I don't have a particularly strong maternal desire at this point, because I do think about you know, they're not going to have contact with any aunts and uncles on my end. If I was to have children with my current partner, Oscar, you know, he's really close with his sisters and his brother and his mum. So, you know, there's that side of the family, which is fabulous. But, it's been a huge part of it, you know, just thinking about what kind of environment I suppose I would want to bring a child into. And when I look back, even growing up, me and my twin used to say to each other, because dad was, you know, in conflict with his siblings, and mum cut off her brother and mum cut off her mum as well. I remember me and my twin saying to each other, like, oh, we're not going to be like that. Like, we will, talk to each other and we will have a relationship in adulthood. And the exact same thing has happened, Yeah, it's been a big factor as to why I don't have a particularly strong maternal desire at the moment, which in some ways is annoying, but then it's not, because it's like I can't force it. And I know I was talking to some girlfriends on the weekend who were like so freaking ready to have kids, and they're just really, really eager. And if I don't have that energy, I'm not ready. Like, I'm still leaning in the no section, and I don't want to have one just for the sake of having one. But then it's also, when you think about when you're older, and with my endometriosis, come that point where I do try to conceive, what's that going to look like? Is it going to be easy? And will future Bridget look back on past Bridget and be like, you idiot, like you should have? But you can't live with that kind of mindset or mentality, because this is how I feel in the moment at the time, and nothing's going to change that. And I can't regret that. Yeah.
It's so true. Like, the decisions that you make for yourself, whether or not, like, there's no way, no one has a crystal ball, no one knows. But I think when you make like decisions that have a lot of thought and have a lot of consideration put into them, as it seems that you are doing, I don't think you're going to wake up when you're 40 or 50 or 60 and be like, wow, I regret that decision, because it's an accumulative decision that has been made many times.
Yeah.
I disagree. I think you can 100% regret decisions down the track. You can't change them, but I think you can be like, well, maybe I shouldn't have made that decision.
Yeah, but I mean, maybe if it's like a one-off thing, but I think people who make a conscious decision to not have children, there's already enough fear-mongering around, you're going to regret that decision. I don't know anyone who made a conscious decision to not have children who has gone on to regret it in their 50s and 60s. The only people who I know have experienced that are people who really wanted to have children but tried fertility treatments too late. That's a different conversation. It's not around like consciously choosing not to have kids. But I mean, I guess everyone is different. But I think people live with that fear enough. I don't think that fear needs to be driven home, that like, oh, you might regret it. People are aware. That's the whole conversation is.
I disagree. And I disagree just because I'm in it. I disagree because I don't know if I want kids or not. And I constantly bounce between if I'm going to regret not having them or if I'm going to regret having them. Like, my seesaw is teetering constantly. Either way, I will feel regret, because I'm not convinced of which way I want to go. So I know that I'm going to have that feeling. I'm hoping that changes very soon.
Yeah. And I hope you get to a point where it's like you can just you just need to be a bit kinder to yourself and honor what you're feeling in that moment and not blame yourself. I think we're so easy and quick to blame ourselves in those situations. And I think in terms of motherhood as well, there's a UK writer called Ruby Warrington who wrote a fabulous book called Women Without Kids. She talks a lot about the mummy binary and how it's so black and white across society that if you're not sure about having kids or it's a no, that must mean you're like selfish or indecisive and just not mature or whatever. But it really is a spectrum where it's not a clear yes or no, and we're all at different points of the spectrum. Like I'm bouncing up and down, Brit's bouncing up and down, and the last thing we need to do is like beat ourselves up about it. But it's hard. Like it's so fucking annoying.
Your endometriosis, so just fill everyone in. How does that affect your fertility?
So if we're going to go like a little bit down the scientific biological route, there's like a structural component. So if you've got endometriosis just popping off down there and it's like a physical barrier or physically impairing the environment in which the egg's trying to like fertilize and do all that kind of stuff. So there's that kind of aspect. The like inflammatory nature of those lesions, I suppose, can impair the function of both the egg and the sperm, and then prevent that correct environment for it to kind of develop and have that implantation kind of stuff. The structural issues, again, because if you might have endo like on your fallopian tubes or whatever. There's also the third one, which I love mentioning, is like painful sex is like a very common symptom of endo. So if you're going to have painful sex, you're like less likely to do it. So that's, I guess, another way.
You're like, abstinence means I can't get pregnant.
Yeah, essentially. But up to 50% of people with endo will experience infertility. And it's just really annoying because it's like, I'm not ready now, but what happens Like I went and got my, the AMH test and stuff, and it was all looking fine, but you just don't know until you go and try to conceive, and anything can happen. I may be able to conceive naturally. I kind of have a feeling, when you just have a feeling that that's not going to happen, or like, your body, like I just have a feeling it's not going to be easy for me.
Yeah.
But that's kind of where it's at. And, I want to freeze my eggs probably in a year's time. So when I'm, down the pointy end of 34, heading into 35. But, another spanner for me is that, like, I live in Perth right now. I moved over here for my partner's work. So I don't have any immediate network here. I wouldn't want to have a child here. I don't know how long we're here for, depending on his work. So that's another conversation. It's like, well, where am I going to freeze my eggs? I'm going to freeze them in Melbourne. Am I going to freeze them in Perth? How do you ship them across the Nullarbor? Like, it's a bit of a head fuck with the fertility front. And endo is just an added layer to it with how it can affect it even happening in the first place.
You asked a really interesting question in your book, which I find fascinating. You said, can a woman who's fought for equality and respect against sexism and misogyny become a bride? Or does that make them a walking contradiction?
This was such a fun chapter. So this is all about marriage.
Yeah, because I'm getting married in this year, mid next year, sorry. And I feel the same. I feel like, the podcast, we are fighting for women's rights constantly. We're always talking about feminism.
Yeah.
But I can't wait to get married at the same time.
This was a very interesting thing and a very fun thing for me to explore, the marriage chapter. So not only whether or not I want to get married, but taking it a step further and kind of leaning into that real curiosity that I've had in my 30s of being like, why do I want to get married? And how did this start? And what's in it for me? So I dived into a real rabbit hole of exploring the origins of the institution and seeing how it has played across cultures over time, how it has evolved. And I think that's a real privilege to even sit and ponder whether or not I want to get married, because in areas of the world, people are still being forced under the age of 18. There's literally just news coming out now of Colombia that they've been able to pass this law that makes it illegal to be married under 18, because 1 in 4 Colombian women and girls were being married under the age of 18. It's been like 17 years of campaigning. So like child brides, non-consensual arranged marriages, that kind of thing. So very lucky that we can even ponder whether or not we want to, and that our lives don't literally depend on it. But yeah, I was just really curious to kind of step into that discussion of, I consider myself feminist, and I think with feminism, there's agency and choice. But with an institution like marriage, where does that come into play? So I spoke to a lot of well-known feminists in Australia for their take, and it was just so interesting because there are feminists who completely oppose it and want to abolish the institution, and then there are feminists who are married and who say yes, there is capacity to redefine this framework and push it in that direction where it works for you, and that it's a personal choice, and that it's a personal, reflection of your relationship and what your marriage means to you. Yeah, and an added complexity is with marriage equality. And I remember reading a book from a lesbian feminist who you would think, if anything, that she would be the one who'd be like, burn it down, but she wanted nothing more than to be married and is married. I think the conversation of abolishing marriage for me is, I can't help but liken it to the gun laws in America, right? Like, we are so far in, you're not going to be able to just abolish marriage, right? So you have to move it forward. And that's what we're seeing with, in Colombia with these legal reforms and stuff. Move it forward in a direction that is going to benefit everyone. It's going to be equal, and redefine it. Like, that's how all social and legal frameworks evolve over time. But it is like, it's a really tricky thing to navigate, because I've definitely had that kind of, there's nothing worse than someone calling you like a fake feminist, or that like, you're not actually what you claim to be, when it's like, I am, but I also have a particular view about this. And I do see the capacity for positive change, and I love people getting married, and that, I don't think that makes me any less of a feminist. And so it was really interesting to speak to feminists across the board on the topic, but it was very respectful. And yeah, I think it just will always come down to a differing opinion.
I mean, it's an interesting debate, isn't it? But I think we're in a sad place when we have to defend ourselves for being feminists if you have made the choice to get married, and how that somehow is a betrayal. And I say this because I know that there is this real push at the moment to be like, burn it to the ground. But I think it's probably more important to acknowledge the privilege that we have to be able to choose what marriage looks like to us, where we live and how we live. That is a privilege that is not bestowed on all women in all places. But certainly here in Australia, if you are not from low socioeconomic, if you're able to have agency and choice, you have the privilege to choose what does your relationship look like and what does marriage mean to you. And not everyone can make that choice. And I think, I look at my marriage specifically and I go, it is an incredible place of equality. But not everybody has that option and not everyone has that choice once they enter into a marriage. And so I think as much as there is the conversation around feminism, there's a huge conversation around privilege that is linked into it as well.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's just so important for me. Like what I would like for me, it's not about judging people who get married or people who strictly oppose it, but I would love everyone to just read into the origins just to have that understanding. And then you make the decision because, again, it's that kind of informed consent of like you knowing what you're signing up for and what it has historically stood for. And marriage is very complex because it has been so different across time, across many cultures. I mean, 19th century, I think it was, Chinese women could marry dead bodies and they would prefer to marry dead bodies so they didn't have to deal with an actual man,
The thing is, though, it's been completely redefined, and when I get married, that does not make me not a feminist anymore. And it makes me angry that there are people out there that are putting such labels on people. And you could do so much advocacy and work for however long, and then you get married and it's like, fuck you, you're not a feminist. I do not believe in that. I do not believe we have to stick to this stringent set of rules that define who and what we are.
I think it's important to remember that everything to this day operates under a patriarchy. So in the sense of marriage, I don't think, abolishing it, because everything operates under patriarchy. So like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't in a way. But I think it is just, coming back to, and we've again seen it with marriage equality, that it continues to evolve at a rapid rate and means something different for everyone. And I think regardless of whether you're married, single, de facto, poly, as long as the end of the day you can say that you feel happy, fulfilled, secure, safe, whatever your relationship status, we don't need to be tearing each other down for that.
Absolutely.
Which is also why I think it's such a fascinating conversation around how it links back into privilege. We spoke to Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love.
And committed.
Yes, and committed.
Yeah.
She's fantastic. It was honestly one of my favorite interviews this year. And she spoke about the statistics of dissatisfaction and unhappiness in married women and how married men are the most happy version and the most fulfilled. They live longer, but married women have shorter lifespans. They're the most unhappy and the most unfulfilled. And that just shows that patriarchal dynamic and why one person is bearing the weight. I mean, we all know the mental load and everything else is so much greater for women, but it is a very new time that we are living in where women are able to find partners who may be progressive enough to not be total dickheads. And then they can define what that relationship looks like for them. But not everyone has the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, and her book, Committed, was such a great read for my own one because, to kind of pick up from where Eat, Pray, Love left off and, her and the Bali guy, I lost my shit when I was like, oh my God, the Bali guy. They both had previously been divorced and they didn't want to get married again, but it kind of came out of necessity for that immigration law for them to live in America. So really great read. And I think, again, just coming back to if you choose to get married, as long as you're doing it for the reasons that will benefit you. And I mean, even in our 30s, I've seen a number of people get married because they feel like they have to, or they feel like it's going to solve their relationship problems and really be a Band-Aid, but it doesn't actually change anything. So it's not really about, for me at least, the ceremony or marriage. It's for all the days that follow. Like when we're talking about relationships, a marriage is not going to suddenly fix everything. And I think just, we need to be mindful of that, particularly in this period of our lives.
Well, I think that sometimes we can look at it as a token of security. You know, that my relationship is more secure because I'm married. But the reality is, I mean, I'm a product of multiple divorces. My parents both got divorced, dad 3 times, mum twice. A marriage is only as good as the paper it's written on if you're not making the commitment in your actual actions in that relationship. It offers no more security than a de facto relationship or anything else.
Yeah. And that was an interesting kind of comparison to be I guess some of the rights that you may be granted just because you're married in terms of, the life admin stuff, like for, the Centrelink is an example for differing like payments or benefits, how that can differ to de facto and how we do kind of see de facto as inferior. And also like quickly just on divorce as well, that's not a failing. Like I had a friend who got divorced at 28, and at the same time she was getting divorced, everyone around us was getting engaged, and she went to her high school reunion and was like, she wore the ring even though she was divorced, but was so embarrassed to tell people. And that's another thing I think is really important to highlight in this period of our lives, that if you do find yourself getting divorced, it's nothing to be ashamed of, and you haven't failed. Like
I have a friend getting divorced now for the second time.
Love that.
And she didn't want to. She's like, oh, how do I start dating again? And saying like, hey, I'm twice divorced already. And I'm like, who cares?
You also don't have to tell them straight away. Like, you don't have to tell them until you're like in a committed relationship, like even then some people may rush to get married and then find themselves in relationships where they're like, fuck, this is not what I thought it was going to be. Better to have divorces under your belt and be in a happy and sustained relationship than be in something purely because you've committed to it and spend the next 10 years of your life fucking miserable. Like that.
Absolutely.
What a horrible life to live.
Yeah.
Bridget, coming from being in this relationship, going through a breakup, and then having to navigate dating in your 30s, which, can leave you feeling like either, and I don't want to say desperate, but like I do think like when I was dating in my 30s at the start, like fuck, I went on The Bachelor because I was like, oh my God, must meet a man. Like it worked out okay. But, what was that like? What was the period of getting back into dating when you kind of felt like you had the plan figured out like for you?
It was utterly confronting because when I entered my previous relationship, Tinder was kind of just breaking through. So we didn't have this dominant digital dating landscape. The culture has entirely shifted since I was last single. So it was really confronting in that sense of being like, oh, it's like, you can't really, and again, being in lockdown, you can't just go meet someone out. It is a very intentional thing to download an app to create and curate a profile and to swipe and to initiate conversations in that manner. It was very unnatural for me. There was also, and I'm mindful of how I say it, but like, you guys will be able to relate when you have a somewhat visibility to your name. So when I went into my last relationship, I wasn't on Triple J or anything. I was nobody. But having like a national radio show, and it's, a small profile, but somewhat still visible, especially in a dating landscape in like Melbourne or something. I was really self-conscious. And I hate saying it because I don't want anyone to feel self-conscious about it, but I did. I hated seeing Bridget 30 as my profile. I really didn't feel comfortable with it. I took my time with it, and I was mindful of what I wanted. And I think this is the important thing, to be mindful and aware and actually have that moment to think, what do I want to get out of this? I wasn't looking for a new relationship. For me, actually, it was just baby steps and little personal development. So like just to initiate a conversation with a guy, to reply to their story on Instagram and have a conversation with a guy
like
that you think's
multiple
hot.
fire flames.
Yeah, the heart eye emoji. But those things are really big and scary for me at 30. And I just had to take it, one step at a time. And I ended up meeting my current partner on an app about a year after this breakup. I mean, he was my only dating app date and my only blind date, in the sense that I didn't know him before I met him on the date. And thank God it went well, because I was kind of getting not defeat. Well, I guess I was getting a bit defeated. Like, it's rough out there. It is rough out there. And to add on that extra kind of insecurity that I wish we didn't have, but we do, because again, how 30 has been portrayed, especially single and 30, Bridget Jones, has not been painted in a positive light, really. So it was hard, but I got through it. And I think more so it's just kind of coming to that understanding now. That single time that I had was so amazing, in that no matter what happens, and if a relationship doesn't work out, like, I know I'll be fine, and I know that I'm focusing on the right things, getting fulfillment from friendships and work, and just having like an even spread, and not putting my heart and soul and everything riding on a romantic relationship. But yeah, it was very sobering and confronting to enter that dating world, especially after heartbreak, when you've been dumped, because that really confirms, as awful as it is, but in a way it kind of confirms you've been rejected by the person who knows you better than anyone. And then it kind of confirms any ounce of negative self-talk that you have about yourself.
Totally.
And you try not to let it happen, but it does.
Yeah,
So
and your partner is 5 years younger than you.
yeah, cougar.
I have zero issues because in the last 10 years I've only dated down. My partner now is significantly younger than me. My ex was 7 or 8 years younger than me. Have you faced, like, I hate to say backlash, but there are definitely stereotypes about women that do date younger men. Did you experience that, or did you feel a bit wary entering into a relationship that was someone that was, you know, still in their mid-20s?
Yeah, I was very wary because like when we were talking I didn't know at the time it was his 26th birthday. That morning of his 26th birthday, I was pulling up to the fertility clinic to like
You're like, these eggs are old, freeze them.
yeah, like we were just on. It was just so funny. Like, and we didn't know at the time until a little bit further down the track when we talked about that day. And I was like, lol, like we could not be more contrasting. But for a 20, what is he now? 28. For someone 5 years younger than me, Oscar's very, very logical, head screwed on. His older brother, who's a year younger than me, is married with 2 kids. So those kinds of conversations were never scary or daunting or too much for him. He's also like a professional athlete, so he has a very disciplined routine, I suppose. But we also had really good character references for each other from a mutual friend that we didn't realize until that kind of popped up. So there was never any fear of being judged, I suppose, that he's 5 years younger than me, because he doesn't act like, it doesn't feel he feels like he's my age.
Yeah.
Feels like he's 33. I think there's definitely been times in terms, and this is like for all relationships, just when you kind of figure out each other's way of communicating and how we navigate conflict and those kind of emotional aspects, that you can sometimes see a bit of a difference. But I wouldn't say that's like a total deal break. Like, those are just, for me, those are just opportunities, as all relationships should have, where you can learn and grow and he can learn and grow. Because yeah, I think if you're not constantly in that kind of cycle of growth with your partner, then that's a bit worrying. I don't know. Like, I always want to feel like I'm learning from him, or I'm learning from myself in response to something that he may have said or that I have said. Yeah. I mean, honestly, the only annoying thing is when people find out what he does and then I'm called a fucking wag. That's annoying, because it's like I am
Like, I'm an author, goddammit.
I feel like, exactly the same way.
Yeah, and it's just really, that's the only annoying thing about our relationship. But
well, you're like, technically I am, because wag is just a wife and girlfriend. So you're like, yeah, cool, technically I am, but it's the negative
we know how
connotation.
people are saying it, and that's what really pisses me off. Like, when I got the Aria's co-hosting gig, the headline was AFL wag, and I was like, that's really insulting to like the 12, like, never mind me being a music presenter for 12 years, doing it last year. I've literally seen Oscar play 3/4 of AFL in the 3 years that we're together. But go off, I'm a wag, you know.
Yeah. Bridget, thank you so much for joining us today. Bridget's book, Figuring Out 30, is going to be out January 7. We're going to link all of the socials, the book in the show notes. So if you want to go grab it, it is a brilliant read that I think everyone should get around.
Thank you so much. It was so nice to catch up from when we last left things. Really much.
So much has happened. Bridget, you're an absolute breath of fresh air. And I know that so many people who are in their trenches of their 30s or even like approaching these years will get so much out of this.
I hope so. Thanks, gals.